This story begins in 1932 when a newspaper reporter, J. Bernard Hatton, and a photographer, Joachim Brandt, were asked to do a story on the Hamburg shipyard in Germany. The day was normal. They interviewed various different workers, took pictures, and by the afternoon, their work was essentially done. While they were leaving, however, they felt the ground shake, and they saw aircraft engines firing down on the shipyard. Buildings were collapsing, people were dying, and it was clear that they were in the middle of an airstrike. They fled the scene and made it to Hamburg, but when they arrived, they noticed that everything was normal. Nobody was scared, and it was like the attack never happened. And that's because it didn't. The airstrike never occurred, and the pictures they took of the event were developed and showed nothing out of the ordinary. The pair couldn't explain it, and for obvious reasons, nobody believed their story. However, 11 years later in 1943, Bernard Hatton was in London and was shocked when he read that morning's newspaper. An airstrike, extremely similar to the one he had already experienced 11 years ago, had actually occurred in Hamburg. It's very difficult to prove that these two had experienced anything of the sort, but it is interesting that they claimed this happened 11 years before it actually did. Unfortunately, there were no major developments or follow-ups to this story, but as far as anyone can tell, the pair stuck to their story until their dying days. When it comes to the topic of time travel, one name is seen multiple times throughout discussions and conversations, and that name is Andrew Basiago, a lawyer from Washington who has made several bizarre claims about his life. He has stated that he was a part of a top-secret program in the 70s that experimented with time travel and teleportation, and that he himself had traveled through time. He has stated that with technology created by Nikola Tesla, that he was sent to 1863 to view Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. He also states that he was sent 1,000,000 years in the past and that he has been to the year 2045. His story gets even stranger when you realize that he has also claimed to have teleported to Mars and that he was the first person to make contact with Martian life. You would think that with such a bizarre, far-fetched story that nobody would want to listen to Andrew, but that's far from the case. He has made several TV appearances and done radio interviews and has made a name for himself through this story.
It wasn't like a 3D movie though, you were actually going back in time.
Yes, we were. There was another device called a plasma confinement chamber that was developed by Dr. Sterling Colgate of the New Mexico Institute of Science and Technology. In that device, we would walk into a field of radioactive plasma. We would experience collapsing, like going through a trap door, and we would go through about 30 minutes of wormholing, just as was sort of depicted on What the Bleak We Know, the documentary.
Yep.
And then we would find ourselves in a past location, and that was the device that was used to send me back to Gettysburg. I then walked from the countryside outside of Gettysburg into Gettysburg on November 19th of 1863. That picture, the famous Josephine Cobb image of Lincoln at Gettysburg, from Lincoln's time, the child on the front left foreground of that picture was me, and it was confirmed as me by the CIA in the early 1970s. I am not making this up.
Wow.
The United States government had different forms of time travel already operational by 1970.
Al Bielek was a member of the American Navy who claimed to have been a part of the Montauk Project, which allegedly was a series of experiments conducted by the US military during the 1940s that would center around the development of psychological warfare, but also included some more left-field research that included things such as invisibility, teleportation, and of course, time travel. Bielek has stated that many of the experiments were successful and that time travel was not only possible, but had been done. He states that in the 1980s, time travel became possible through the experiments that he was a part of, and that he himself had traveled through times on several occasions, including trips to 100,000 BC and the year 6037. Later that decade, Bielek decided to go public with this info and told his story until the day he passed. His most famous interviews were with Art Bell on Coast to Coast AM, where Bielek went into detail about his experience in this alleged project. George Van Tassel was a famous conspiracy theorist who made many dubious claims while he was alive. These included many UFO sightings, making contact with aliens, and building a functional machine that could travel people through time. He took part in many TV interviews to discuss these interactions and discoveries, and in 1964, he was interviewed for 20 minutes to talk about an array of these topics, starting with the 4-story time travel machine that he had built. The interview is interesting because George seems quite rational and intelligent, and also because it took place over 50 years ago, which shows us how long this conversation has been taking place in the media.
Now, George, I don't care whether the machine is 4 stories high or 40 stories high or 4 inches high. When I say calmly and unexcitedly, a time machine, what does your formula tell you you can do with a time machine?
Well, Jack, our formula has no time factor, which electronic formula does have. And on the other hand, electronic science has only had 2 dimensions to work with, the electric pattern and the magnetic pattern perpendicular to it. And we discovered a 3rd zone, which we call a time zone, and we are working through this zone with an effort to orient the magnetic field to give us other results than our science can obtain at present.
George, just double talk to me. A time machine means to me a little box that I can go into and go back 5,000 years or forward 10,000 years. Is that what your formula tells you you can do?
Well, Jack, this isn't a little box. This is a 4-story machine focusing fields that we can orient to produce this zone big enough for a man to get into. It isn't a box.
But what happens to the man when he gets into the zone? I'm all agog with curiosity.
Jack, we've discovered this zone is subject to thought. Now, since time doesn't record events the way we do on calendars and clocks, you could only record an event by thinking of it. Now, theoretically, we believe we can take a videotape magnetic camera into the time zone and photograph Lincoln's Gettysburg Address or Caesar's armies marching or anything that's ever happened.